there, Dragons! It's Paige here with your weekly Thunder Index, where we discuss all things science, storms, stars, and sustainability. Welcome back to our last week of sustainability episodes. Last week, we began our conversation about environmental law, specifically touching on the Paris Agreement and its ramifications from around the world. But even though we have an international agreement protecting the Earth, who is making these changes, how are we making these changes, and who is regulating it? In the United States, we are lucky to have an entire governing organization revolving our environment. Remember the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency? This is the organization controlled by the US government that makes US laws that regulates the human health and the environment. Now, this spans anywhere from pollution control to drinking water management. What is so amazing is that this agency was created from social push for care of the environment and in part from creation of Earth Day. In the 1960s and 70s, there were so many factors that led and pushed people to believe and care for the environment. Some of the very obvious was the pollution that was being created in factory towns, which was like pretty much everywhere in the US. Rivers, yes, the things made of water, were catching on fire because of how many chemicals were in them. Inner cities were filled with smog, making it uncomfortable to breathe. And finally, people in the science community started to realize what great harm we were doing to our environment. One of the biggest advocates for environmental law, and one of the first, was Rachel Carson. She was a female biologist, writer, and ecologist in the early 1900s. How cool is that? She was born in 1907, and her most notable work, which is now famous in US law, was published 2 years before her death in 1964. Being an ecologist, Carson saw some awful things that factories were producing as waste, and she decided to write about it. She was able to get a 3-part series in The New Yorker in 1962. Why The New Yorker? Well, she was very strategic, and she knew that sitting President John F. Kennedy read this paper every day. This series was then condensed and published as a book later that summer in August of 1962. The book was titled Silent Spring. The book called out 3 main things. The first was large chemical companies for their mistreatment of the environment. It also called out citizens for not caring about the longevity of the land that they live on. But most of all, she blamed the government for allowing this kind of harm to its citizens and its property. This work is over 400 pages of stories and research that Carson has gathered over 6 years. She was trying to get people to believe her in order to save the planet. This book was an instant bestseller and became the talking points of many households, which in turn pushed environmental issues up in the political agenda. Like we explained in our Earth Day video, Earth Day was a result of public opinion changing. Carson's book and the recent moon landing were 2 things that were really large components of getting these things in motion. So the rest is history. There were people that cared about an issue, they got other people to care, and the government had to listen. Just like social issues we see today. So now we have the EPA, which controls toxins in building materials, all waste and byproducts that come from manufacturing, and much, much more. People's entire professions are now dedicated to the study of environmental law and the upholding or change of environmental law. Though having regulations that protect our environment help all living things on this planet, it does not help all living things financially. The biggest opposers of environmental laws today are large manufacturing companies. Just by these companies existing, they create pollution. This is where environmental engineers come in. One section of environmental engineering deals with how these companies can still function and produce less harmful toxins in the process. Many engineers are trying to create more carbon sequestering technologies, especially for those large smokestacks that you see spewing endless amounts of smoke into the air. This is because it's the greenhouse gases that are released when burning carbon-based substances that create climate change. The biggest problem with this solution right now is that this kind of technology is very expensive. A study by MIT found that it may cost coal power plants up to $330,000 per megawatt to install controls for particulate matter. This means for a typical plant producing 500 megawatts, it could cost more than $107 million to install controls at a newly built plant. And it could cost $165 million to retrofit an existing facility. As you can see, we have come a long way since the 1960s in terms of recognition of environmental preservation. but we still have a very long way to go. So if you're interested in helping the environment, there are so many things that you can do. You could be a lawyer, you could be a scientist, and you could even be an engineer. But even better, you could just be an advocate and lead by example. Join us next week when we talk about all things recycling. Because really, do we actually know how recycling works? But before we say goodbye, I want to leave you with positive images of clouds, not those gross chemically filled ones from factories. Today's cloud of the week is a lenticular cloud. These clouds are pretty cool. They often look like a lens or a saucer. These clouds have an altitude of up to 40,000 feet and are typically a visible sign of mountain waves in the air. So if you see a mountain and you see a saucer-shaped cloud above it, that is a lenticular cloud. On the ground, they can result in very strong gusty winds in one place. A fun fact about lenticular clouds, unlike most clouds that are carried along by the wind, these clouds appeared fixed in space. They never move from the spot where they were formed. The waves which cause these lenticular clouds are called standing waves because they remain the same distance from the mountain, even though the air itself is moving along at a considerable speed. And since the waves remain fixed in position, so too do the clouds which form at their crests. These clouds are called the lenticular clouds because they have thin and sometimes pointed ends with a thicker and broader center, resulting in a cross-section similar to that of an optical lens, rather like an almond, in fact. Okay, but the coolest part about lenticular clouds is they have an optical deception. If you look at one of these clouds, it is not the same cloud you see all the time. Okay, so follow me on this. The cloud is constantly being formed again and again on the windward side as the moisture condenses from the rising air and disappearing on the lee side as the air descends and reabsorbs the water droplets traveling with it. So basically, these water droplets are just being reabsorbed, creating a new cloud constantly. So if you see one cloud and it's lenticular, and you go away and you come back after 15 minutes, it may look the same, but it's probably a different cloud. And that, dragons, is all of these science, storms, stars, and sustainability that I have for you this week. It is always thundering in Philadelphia. I'll see you next week.